What a time we are living in, church. I mean, first, I'm going to admit that there's been a change in me for many, many reasons, including that I just wanted to be happier. I pulled myself off of social media, and I decided to limit my consumption of the news because the way I was living, I was too wrapped up in the news cycle, and that doesn't work with circadian rhythms or with anything else, really. You know what I mean? But sometimes you can just get so obsessed with what's happening that you just want to know more and more, and it can drag you down. So I decided that I was going to pull back from that because maybe I didn't have to know everything. And maybe humans were never designed to know everything, and maybe we didn't always have the internet and access to so much information, and don't necessarily have the capacity to absorb it. We, though, are living in times. So, yes, we can take some in, but not everything. But right now, you don't have to be a news junkie to know that things are not well. In this country and in our world, things might be, as some would say, a bit of a hot mess. Which I don't mean dismissively, quite the opposite, actually. But if you care about, well, children and their safety, or our global neighbors who are at war, or let's say democracy, if you care about, come on now, reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, if you care about just about anything besides just yourself, it doesn't look so good. In fact, you could be drawn to despair. And I want to address that despair before we get into the resurrection good news. What is despair? Oxford defines it as the absence of hope. It comes from the Latin desperare. See, I told you we're going to have some church nerd moments. And so the D is like to be without, and the sperare is the hope. So to despair is to de-hope. And once we fall into de-hoping, it can be hard to climb back from that. It becomes more than a habit. You know, the reformers described this sort of thing as like a cloak that covers you. And that sounds right to me. Have you ever been covered in despair, covered up from your ability to hope? And now I want to talk about what hope is so that we're not making any assumptions. And I read somewhere that hope is a way of clinging to possibility. Hope is a way of clinging to possibility. And you've heard me say before, if you have ever heard me preach on this, that hope is a discipline and not so much a feeling, but it's a discipline, it's an act, it's a verb. But when we're covered in despair, we can't build that discipline of hope. It's like it's blocked away from us. And in a beautiful essay in the New York Times this week, a man named Esau McCulley, who's a professor out at Wheaton College in Illinois, reflected on these themes of hope and despair. And he wrote, I have it up on screen for you, actually. I have never been a big fan of hope. It's a demanding emotion that insists on changing you, forcing you to believe more is possible. And I understand that because sometimes when we're caught in a state of despair, we push away hope. Now, here is what he followed that up with. Hate, by the way, is a much less insistent master. It asks you only to loathe. It is quite happy to have you to itself, and it doesn't ask you to go anywhere. And what I really appreciate about this framing is that he demonstrates that hope is actually more work. Hate's easy. It's so easy to slip into when you're cloaked in despair for too long, because in despair we resist beauty and we resist love and joy. Don't you know that person who just can't let themselves see and behold the good in front of them? It's not their fault. It's because they're cloaked in despair. And when you're cloaked in despair, you can be more susceptible to those evil forces that will push you into doing what's wrong. And see, when we give into the hate that comes with despair, then we're static and we're stuck and we can't move or grow, and there's no room for spirit anymore. And it makes us things like cowards, and it makes us cause harm. And it messes up the planet. And that hate really does, I'm going to admit, win too often. Hate thought that it won at Calvary. By all measures, it would have. Hate resisted Jesus' words of liberation and acts of healing. Hate brought the rulers to quake when they learned about that Jesus, even before he was born, and to shake in their despotic beds. Hate conspired against him and turned the state to fear him and ultimately to kill him. Hate betrayed him. Hate arrested him. Hate condemned him. Hate marched him to that hill where they nailed him to that tree. Hate caused him to be laid in that tomb. And that's what hate does. And I'll say that we see it now too, because my God, the news. But let me tell you about something. Early in the morning. Early that Sunday morning, he got up. He got up when the men were hiding and the women were on their way. Sometime in that morning, early Sunday morning, he got up. He got up. Will you say that with me? He got up. You have to remember this, because when he got up and when he showed back up and he came back and he kept loving and he kept feeding and providing and teaching and he kept on and he keeps on. And when he got up, the dimensions of hope changed. Let me explain this. When Jesus came back from the grave, everything about hope changed. It shifted from this kind of more amorphous concept to something concrete and tangible and real, because death was done. Just look at his time with Mary Magdalene. I don't know if she came to the tomb out of hope or despair or what, it really doesn't matter, but what I do know is the moment she recognized Jesus and she fell on her feet to hold on to him, the dimensions of her hope changed. And what she did, we can all do, because we can cling to Jesus too, because hope is clinging to possibility. And now she had this Jesus to cling to, and so do we. And Jesus wasn't just a concept, he was flesh and he was blood. And now he was promise fulfilled. Where I go, there you may go also. And early that Sunday morning, Jesus gave us something to cling to that is real and present and eternal and ours. He gave himself. And if we could just find a way as a people to cling to Jesus tighter than we cling to anything else, if we could cling to the hope that God gives us and cast aside the cloak of despair, if we could live as if our hope, our belief that it can and will be better than we've ever seen before, we will be more powerful than the forces of hate that so actively oppose the good and hope. That is how we change the world, folks. That's exactly the formula. And that's how we get creative and even become co-creators with God. And that's our calling. So as I prepare to take my seat, I'm just going to close with the story. Just this week, my family was really honored to join Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove from Park Avenue Synagogue, who's the rabbi just around the corner, and his beautiful family, and they live right here, at their home for the Passover Seder. And my child, diligent and earnest as ever, watched so many YouTube videos to prepare for the Seder. It was her first, and she wanted to be ready. So I watched some of them with her, and this meant, of course, that she had to review the story of the Exodus, since that is what is retold at the Passover Seder. And that's the foundational root of Passover. So Jesus, by the way, had celebrated the Passover with his disciples right before he was killed. So you see the context where it all just comes together. But as it turns out, the Exodus is a pretty bloody story. It's war, essentially. And it was a war that eventually liberated the Hebrews. But one of the traditional ways to retell this story is a very, very catchy children's song, which in Hebrew, I told you we were going to get to some Hebrew, is called Dayenu. And all week, as I was thinking about what word to offer you, as I was praying to God, what word should I give the people? What can I offer to them? This catchy song just kept ringing in my head. And I was like, well, God, come on, give me some sort of inspiration. But I just had that earworm going. Dayenu. And then it occurred to me, maybe that's the word. So here's the song. I'm going to teach it to you. Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. You see how catchy that is? This is not a song I would choose to have in my head. I'll admit that. And I kept hearing, Dayenu. God, help me figure out what to say. Dayenu. But God, why? Why do you make me wait so long? Dayenu. And finally, I thought, maybe they need to know what that means. Because here's what Dayenu means. It would have been enough. Dayenu, it would have been enough. It would have been enough to form us from the dust. It would have been enough to breathe life into the clay. It would have been enough to bring us covenants and promises and to deliver on them. It would have been enough to free the people from bondage. It would have been enough to rain manna down from heaven, and any of this would have been enough, Dayenu. But wait, there's more. Because in church, now we have Jesus to add to these blessings, and it would have been enough for him to heal the sick and to care for the poor. It would have been enough for him to open up the scriptures so we could understand them all differently. It would have been enough to be the way and the truth and the life. It would have been enough for him to demonstrate radical love, to point us to his Abba, to drive the money changers from the temple and to bless our every meal. That would have been enough, but God wasn't done. And that's my word to you, church. With God, it could have been enough, but God is never done. God is never done. God said, you thought death was the end. Watch me now. Look at Jesus. He's risen. He's risen. Christos anesti. Alithos anesti. Christos anesti. Christos anesti. Christos anesti. Come on and give it up for God. Christos anesti. Christos anesti. God is so good and so strong, and God could have done enough just giving us life and blessings, but God keeps working and is never finished with you. That is an eternal word, and let the church say, amen.